Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Eager Beaver headquarters here at the Burlap Palace. Have you ever been in a situation that you absolutely despised? Now everyone around you is going to say, "Oh, it's not that bad, suck it up and get used to it." But you think differently. You want out. Well, ladies and gentlemen, young Winston Churchill found him in the exact same situation in the year of 1899. On November 18th of 1899, young Winston Churchill found himself interned here at the Staats Model Prison camp for POW officers during the Second Boer War. He would consider this one of the darkest and worst times of his life. However, everyone outside of that camp was hearing tale of his incredible action at the Battle of Escourt. You see, Winston had come back a living legend, and the world over was talking about this incredible battle and this amazing young man who happened to rescue a train in distress. In particular, the plate layers of the train line that he rescued had a quote like this to say: "The railwaymen who accompanied the armored train this morning asked me to convey to you their admiration of the coolness and pluck displayed by Mr. Winston Churchill. The whole of our men are loud in their praise of Mr. Churchill, who, I regret to say, has been taken prisoner. I respectfully ask you to convey their admiration to a brave man." Winston Churchill was very quickly becoming a national hero across the Commonwealth and a household name, and as exciting as all of that is, he wasn't really aware of any of that because he was in prison. Kind of a stroke of bad luck, I guess. Years later, after the war, Winston Churchill was quoted saying this about his time in prison: "I hated it more than I have ever hated any other period in my whole life." You see, prison even back in the 1800s just kinda sucked. Not a huge change from today. When Churchill and his compatriots arrived at the Staats Model School-prison, they were immediately bombarded by all the other prisoners asking for brand new information. And for someone like Churchill, he rather bristled at this moment and did not feel particularly kind in speaking to his fellow prisoners at that moment. He is quoted as having said this later on: "The sort of reception accorded to a new boy at a private school, or as it seemed to me, to a new arrival in hell." Perhaps there's some exaggeration there, but his misery is most certainly noted. And as miserable as Churchill made it out to be, I have to say his living conditions were actually incredibly nice. You see, the Boers who had captured all of these officers wanted to be seen as civilized people. So, they allowed greater civility to the officers held at the Staats Model. The pleasures that they were allowed themselves included, but were not limited to, having their own personal soldier servants take care of them. Visitors were allowed. Newspapers could be purchased at will. They could keep track of the war on a giant map. They could also supplement their prison food through Mr. Beauchamp's store and buy luxury items including cigarettes, beer, new suits, and have haircut and shaving services rendered onto them. Frankly, that's kinda better than most modern prisons have it. Kinda jealous if that's the case. And just for a quick reference, here's an example of Mr. Beauchamp's store in the modern day. A bit of a distant relative, but still in operation. That's incredible. And in much as we jest, Churchill himself was actually quite open in admitting that where he was being held in captivity was actually quite nice. But he did have a quote like this to share with all of us about his time in prison: "You are in the power of your enemy. You owe your life to his humanity and your daily bread to his compassion. You must obey his orders, go where he tells you, stay where you are bid, await his pleasure, possesses your soul in patience." As cushy as Winston Churchill was in his new imprisonment, he still certainly wanted to get out. He constantly bombarded anyone he could with the fact that he was not a combatant, but a journalist. He would do just about anything to get out and wrote many letters, sent out many correspondence, and constantly pleaded his case to anyone who would listen. However, the government of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State were not really going to believe any of that. Someone like Piet Joubert, in fact, had a quote like this to say:
"In one word, he must not be released during the war."
By the very first week of December, Churchill had frankly realized that talking was going to get him nowhere, and that the only way to get out of prison was to break out. Winston was able to work with two other gentlemen in order to try and make their escape plan possible, one being his old friend from the Battle of Escourt, Almer Haldane, and the other was a sergeant known as Adam Brocky, and that is the only picture that we are known to have of him. Forgive me if it might be wrong, but it's the best we could do given the resources that we have. Someone like Sergeant Adam Brocky was also incredibly useful because he not only understood the terrain that they were within, but he spoke the languages of both Zulu and Dutch. This would be invaluable in an escape effort going across southern Africa. That being said, Brocky and Churchill did not entirely get along, because Brocky was rather a silent, strong type of figure, whereas Winston Churchill was rather a showman and very talkative, and both Haldane and Brocky were concerned that Winston might just run his mouth off on the great escape they were attempting to pursue and get them all caught, and at even worse circumstance, be killed. On December 11th of 1899, the three men, Winston Churchill, Sergeant Brocky, and Haldane, planned to make their very first attempt at the escape. They would go out into the prison yard, enter a porta-potty sort of latrine made of metal. They would sit in it and wait for the guards not to look, and through the cover of darkness, when the guards weren't looking, they would jump the paltry metal fence and make their way through Pretoria. It's a fairly simple plan, but surprisingly, it might have actually just worked. Had it not been for the fact that the guards were immediately suspicious of them on the night of the 11th, and really never quit staring at the outdoor toilet. With that known, Haldane called the event off, and they would try again tomorrow. The following night, on December 12th of 1899, under the cover of darkness, Sergeant Adam Brocky was the first to go and sit in the outdoor toilet and hope that the guards wouldn't notice. However, they spent an incredibly long time just watching Brocky sit within his own latrine. Brocky eventually gave up the effort and left. He told Haldane that it was rather hopeless for them to try, and Haldane then went and told Churchill that there really was no chance. But for some reason, Churchill said that he was still going to give it an effort and try. However, Haldane and Brocky really didn't understand what Churchill was about to do. Churchill went into the private porta-potty latrine and sat there for over 30 minutes. And somehow, with great luck, him sitting there made the guards so bored that they decided to look away and take a cigarette break. And that was all the time that Winston Churchill needed to run out of the latrine, hop the poultry fence, and fall over the other side. Now initially, when Churchill jumps the other side, he's incredibly elated by this. He can't believe it. He's just escaped. But then he realizes two things not working in his favor. One, it's pitch black darkness, and it's very difficult to see right now. And two, he just jumped the fence of the prison, and there's no chance he can get back in. Now the guards still haven't noticed that Winston left the toilet, and they're roughly 15 yards away from him, so he quickly scrambles to a nearby house garden and hides in a bush. And in his mind, he's still expecting someone like Brocky and Haldane to make the attempt next, so he waits there for an entire hour, hoping that they'll show up. However, after that hour, he realizes that no one is coming. He makes his way back to the latrine and whispers to a man inside that he's made his escape and that the other two are now more than welcome to come along. Haldane hears this message and is absolutely alarmed because he had called the whole thing off, but now it's too late for him to be involved. He makes the best effort he can and tells Winston that he's now entirely on his own, and Winston is left outside in a bush of a garden in the middle of Pretoria, completely surrounded by the enemy in the middle of the night. Now, initially, Churchill is quite skeptical about his own ability to escape. However, something in him says, be bold about this, and step forward. And he does. He's very fortunate for the fact that he's no longer wearing any of his military accoutrements. he's not dressed up as anything other than an ordinary civilian, because while he was in prison, he ordered a brown flannel suit. And with that brown flannel suit and a floppy hat he borrowed from a priest within the prison, he now just looks like any other civilian walking through Pretoria. So, he makes sure to avoid checkpoints, but for the most part, he's walking entirely tall, out in the open, through the streets in the middle of night in war-torn Pretoria. Churchill is walking around town, however, he realizes he doesn't have much of a direction other than to hopefully find a way out. But from there, where can he go and what can he do? He's also concerned because his friend Haldane really had all the food. Winston Churchill on his own person has roughly 75 English pounds, 4 melting bars of chocolate, and an old crumbling biscuit. He doesn't have any extra food, maps, and he doesn't even have a compass. So, he's nearly quite entirely lost. As worrying as that is, Churchill has a great break of luck. The clouds overhead break away, and he's able to identify Orion's star. And with that, he uses it to coordinate his method out of the city ever so better and into the greater veld and grasslands. Churchill also has a really great line about seeing Orion's star simply being, "Now he should lead me to freedom." And there's something to be appreciated about geographically following a star and hoping for the best. Anyone ever remember that old Glenn Miller song, "When You Wish Upon a Star"? Classic. Following Orion's star, he travels south and then east, because now he's making the effort to make it to Portuguese East Africa. Now, within Portuguese East Africa, Winston is hoping to make it to the British consulate located in Lourenço Marques, which will offer him his full and total freedom. However, that's more than 300 miles away from his current location, and he's traveling at the middle of night on foot, following a star. So, hoping for the best, walking away from the prison camp and avoiding all guards, he makes it about 30 minutes out of Pretoria, where he comes upon his first railroad track. Once he found that railroad track, it again became very difficult for him to actually ascertain his direction. So, he took one hell of a big guess, hoped that he was walking to the east, and then proceeded eastward, he hoped, for 2 hours down that railroad track, hoping to avoid any guards. After walking roughly 2 hours or more, he came upon a train station. Now, he stayed away from it, but he decided here was the perfect opportunity to hopefully get on a train and get far away from Pretoria. So he climbed into a railway ditch, hid behind some shrubbery, and waited roughly 1 hour for the next train to come by. Now, did he know what train to take? Absolutely not. He was guessing, but he figured the first train was the best train. And when one train came by, he took his best luck and chances and threw himself at the train. He missed it once, missed it twice, but on the third try, his hands grabbed on and he was pulled away into the African veld. That night, Churchill worked his way into a boxcar which was full of old dirty bags. He climbed his way into the very bottom, found it rather comfortably warm, hid himself as best he could, and then completely and utterly passed out. When Churchill awoke, he didn't know how long he had been asleep. However, he did realize that the sun had risen, and that before he made it to the next train station, it would be very wise to get off the train expediently. Without much hesitation at all, Churchill threw the bags off of him, opened up the door to the boxcar, and threw himself out of the train at full speed. And remarkably, he was uninjured. Although Churchill had a very small amount of food that he was savoring and enjoying to the best of his ability, what he really needed was water, and by 10 o'clock a.m. in the middle of the hot South African fields and veld, he was becoming rather disoriented and extremely dehydrated. He made his way up to a very small hill, went into a grove of trees, laid back and attempted to sleep and figure out what he would do next. However, sleep would rather elude him. He was far too worried, far too heated, and frankly, strangely so exhausted that sleep could not even be possible. Although Winston Churchill didn't know it at the time, where he landed was actually extremely fortuitous. He came into the town of Witbank, and Witbank was roughly 200 miles from Lourenço Marques, Portuguese East Africa. So if he could persevere longer and find another train, he might just be able to make it out. But he was still deep within enemy territory. Meanwhile, back at the Staats Model Prison, no one had really noticed on the morning of December 13th, 1899, that Winston Churchill had gone that morning. The sun had risen, and there was no great commotion. So, who do you think would be the first person to know that Winston Churchill had gone? Ever so surprisingly, it was the prison barber who was the first person to realize that Winston, 1, owed him money, and 2, Winston was late for his haircut. The barber brought up a fuss which brought in more guards, and when the guards and the barber couldn't find him, and then the commandant couldn't locate him, the entire prison became surrounded by soldiers, press paper newsmen, government officials, and the local police. The area became an absolute madhouse. Eventually, the guards would discover, located on Winston's bed, a note that he had written regarding his escape, which Winston had hoped would be seen as something cheeky and clever and daring, but the Boer guards only saw it as deeply insulting and rather infuriating. Allow me now to read this particular note to you.
Dear Mr. D'Souza, I do not consider that your government was justified in holding me, a press correspondent and a non-combatant, as a prisoner, and I have consequently resolved to escape. The arrangements I have succeeded in making, in conjunction with my friends outside, are such as give me every confidence, but I wish, in leaving you this hastily and unceremoniously, to once more place on record my appreciation of the kindness which has been shown me and the other prisoners by you. And I'm going to skip here now to the ending for a quick conclusion. In conclusion, I desire to express my obligations to you, and to hope that when this most grievous and unhappy war shall have come to an end, a state of affairs may be created, which shall preserve at once the national pride of the Boer and the security of the British, and put aside and stop the rivalry and enmity of both races. Regretting that circumstances have not permitted me to bid you a better farewell, believe me, yours very sincerely, Winston Churchill.
If you can read in between the lines, this definitely sounds like something a cocky 25-year-old would write to his parents. So, good going, Winston. The recapture of Winston Churchill became the #1 priority of the Boer government. It was so highly prized that for almost a week, it would seem like they even forgot about the entirety of the war, because Winston Churchill was now priority #1 for all of the Boer government to regain, recapture, and throw back in the prison. They would not suffer this humiliation lightly. There was a wanted poster put out. Winston Churchill was now wanted dead or alive for the price of 25 English pounds. It almost reads like one of those classic American westerns at this point, doesn't it? Winston had decided to wait that night until further travel was possible. He was hoping that the darkness would deeper conceal him and keep the guards away, because nearly every train station, every town, every bridge and road crossing were now crawling with Boer guards looking to recapture him. All of that said, Winston was also becoming rather delirious from a lack of food and a lack of water, and frankly, just the emotions of the moment. He was hoping to find people that might be sympathetic to his cause. He made his way down from his hill at night, and made his way towards he thought was a local African fire, because he was hoping that the Africans in the village would be sympathetic to his needs and not the Boers. Very soon, however, Winston realized that he had not walked into a small town or a local fire surrounded by tribesmen. No, he had walked into an entirely industrialized mining facility. This is again one of those moments where everything could be ruined for Winston. He could be captured right away, he was in a deep industrial area, and he didn't speak the language at all. However, he tried luck. He walked up to a nearby housing, knocked upon the door, and then introduced himself to the man who answered it. Initially, Winston tries to lie his way through. He's speaking perfect English, claiming to be a Boer citizen, and that somehow he's had a terrible accident. However, the man at the door, speaking both Dutch and English, knows that Winston is lying. He invites Winston to come into his house, sits him at a table, and then pulls a revolver on Winston and asks very politely that Winston tell the truth. And from there, Winston divulges everything about his journey thus far. And here, you think that the great adventure of Winston Churchill's life is over. Oh my god, Winston is the luckiest man alive. You have no idea. The man that he met is named John Howard. John Howard is an English subject who happens to be working in the mines at that time and is the mine manager. He is deeply sympathetic to Winston's needs and says that he'll help him. Further, he has friends that will also help Winston. My favorite quote from this night's meeting actually comes from John Howard directly, which states, "Thank God you have come here. It is the only house for 20 miles where you would not have been handed over, but we are all British here, and we will see you through." Is Winston Churchill not the luckiest man alive? Really, the man walks under some kind of golden star. He is the luckiest man in history. I am so jealous. I wish I was that fortunate during the tax season. Now, once the Boer War had commenced, the large majority of British subjects and citizens had been forced out of the Transvaal and the Orange Republic by the Boers because they could be potential spies and in general just cause trouble for their war efforts. However, highly specialized British subjects were retained, and in this case, someone like John Howard and his compatriots were allowed to stay at the mining facility in Witbank because they were the only people specialized enough to handle it. So, fortune once again worked in Winston's favor. The men that would be helping Winston all worked for the Transvaal and Delagoa Bay Colliery. These men again included John Howard, who sadly we don't have a picture of, the secretary there, who we also do not have a picture of, this man here, known as Dan Dewsnap, he was the lead engineer, and then two other local Scottish miners known as Joe McKenna and Joe McHenry, who also, sadly, we do not have pictures of. Kind of disappointing not to have a name to put with the face and a face to put with the name, because these men are naturally known as heroes. These men in the early morning hours quickly took Winston to the mineshaft elevator, where they lowered him roughly 90 feet down into the earth. Further, they were taking him to a newer development. They were leading him deep into the new mine where they had a pony stable available. And this one had not yet been used by the ponies, so Winston's quite fortunate to find his sleeping accommodations very comfortable. They gave him candles, a box of cigars, 2 roasted chickens, that is a great dinner right there, as well as blankets, more candles, and most of all, the word that they would keep him safe until they could figure out what to exactly do with him and how to smuggle him out of enemy territory. Once these men had left him, he was left alone largely in the dark, and his only compatriots were the white rats that scurried around the floor. They were relatively harmless, however, Winston did find it rather difficult to sleep with so many of them crawling across him constantly. Winston would stay down there for a while until certain miners began to be suspicious that someone might be staying in the mines. That or a ghost was inhabiting the area. They couldn't tell the difference, so they didn't bother to go anywhere near Winston's area. But still, Winston would eventually be moved above ground into a secret compartment in John Howard's office. However, they also knew that wouldn't last long. But soon, they had an escape plan fully prepared and ready. On December 19th of 1899, at 2 o'clock a.m., very early in the morning, all the men got Winston Churchill quickly smuggled onto a train that was headed to Portuguese East Africa. This train in particular was going to be hauling a large amount of raw cotton and wool. The baled cotton was owned by a man named Charles Burnham, who was aware that Winston was going to be taking this very dangerous smuggling trek, and he agreed to go along with Winston in the very front of the train, as well as just to make sure that Winston could safely be brought across border. You see, Mr. Burnham was going to make sure Winston made it across and had brought with him a great deal of alcohol and money in order to bribe anyone he needed to get Winston across the border. Burnham would also bribe these men under the guise that he simply wanted his cotton to be unmolested and unharmed and expediently brought to Portuguese East Africa because he had a very particular, highly specialized sale to participate in. This Winston kid has the best friends in the world, just saying. Within the car that Winston was held was a small grotto that had been dug into the cotton, and Winston was incredibly fortunate because the men left him with several wonderful items, including a revolver, 2 roast chickens, a loaf of bread, a melon, an assortment of sliced meat, 3 bottles of tea, 1 bottle of whiskey, and a compass. As far as smuggling operations go, this might be the most luxurious one I've ever heard of. I am so jealous because I don't even get to take that kind of stuff camping. Now, most of the smuggling of Winston Churchill actually went incredibly well and highly successfully. There weren't too many issues for the most part, though, admittedly, it took several hours of hoping, praying, sitting, waiting, and bribing people to get ever so further those 200 miles to Portuguese East Africa. Charles Burnham was able to do a magnificent job keeping Winston fully hidden. Even better, he was able to largely talk his way past most of the guards, and they were very soon at the final station of the day that they had to pass. That being said, this final station, Kumeteport, was also one of the most dangerous and largest and most heavily guarded in the entire area because it's the final one before the border. What was troubling for Winston and for Burnham was the fact that the guards there would not let Burnham continue along on this particular freight train. You see, in order to go across the border, he would have to take a passenger train. They were concerned that he would be breaking some form of law crossing the border and wanted to ensure that he would not bother their inspection of the goods. As much as Burnham tried to bribe his way through, they simply would not let him. However, they said his goods would be unbothered and that he could go back and collect them once he crossed the border. And again, the fates of the world were entirely in Winston's hands. Somehow, after several hours of sitting and lying and being incredibly quiet, none of the guards noticed Winston, and the freighter was allowed to pass with all of its baled cotton. And, by 4:00 p.m., Winston was reunited with Burnham and had now fully made his way in to the capital of Portuguese East Africa. Although Winston was now in Lourenço Marques, he was actually not safe because Lourenço was now a great melting pot for most of Africa. There were many Boers, many Brits, many native Africans, and plenty of mercenaries walking the street, and many factions would be more than overjoyed to collect on the bounty that was currently placed on Winston's head. Burnham carefully guided Winston through the streets, and they did their very best to keep a low profile. Winston was also fortunate that he was incredibly covered in dirt and soot from his traveling, and therefore looked more like a poor vagrant than the son of an aristocrat. Something about being a modern gray man there, I suppose. Once the consulate was in sight, Winston made a break for it and made his way through the very front gates. And it certainly startled the guards and the secretary, who all they saw was some strange vagrant running around covered in black soot, breaking through their barrier. Initially, the secretary told him that he needed to leave, but Winston, being the son of an aristocrat, wasn't going to hear any of that. He demanded that immediately he be sent to the consulate general, and with great fortune, the general happened to hear that, and the consulate general came down, and after rubbing off some soot, immediately realized that before him was the now freed Winston Churchill, safely back in British hands. On December 23rd of 1899, Winston Churchill is safely returned to the port of Durban, and here he's given an incredible hero's welcome. People all over are celebrating this young man's escape and his heroism for the Battle of Escourt. Trains are going by, tooting their whistles. You have boats constantly giving out the shrill sound of their horn. Further, thousands, tens of thousands of people line the streets waving the Union Jack, hoping to catch a glimpse of this young man. Winston, of course, gives one of his very famous impromptu speeches, and the newspapers the world over are recording it. Everyone wants a picture with this man, everyone wants to touch him and see him. The incredible welcome that he gets is just overwhelming for Winston, because for the first time in his life, he feels that he's achieved the hero's welcome that he so greatly desired. Even more fascinating is the fact that Winston Churchill is brought to then-acting General Redvers Buller, and Buller tells Winston that he can have whatever he wants. Kind of like a gift from Father Christmas there. And Winston immediately tells Redvers that he wants to get into the fight with a commission as an officer in the British Army. Now, Redvers is put into a bit of a difficult political situation here, because you cannot be a correspondent and a member of the military at the same time, receiving full pay from both. However, judging by circumstances, Redvers pulls a little bit of that poppycock away. Redvers says that Winston can indeed be enlisted as an officer and have a full commission. However, since he works for the newspaper, he cannot be paid for his commission within the military. Regardless, Winston is overjoyed by this news and quickly makes his way back into the war, hoping to see a little more action. Winston Churchill is soon a fully commissioned officer, without pay mind you, in the South African Light Horse, and he will stay there for the remainder of the more exciting parts of the war, including leading the relief into Ladysmith and being present at the Battle of Spionkop. By October of the year 1900, Winston Churchill is also finally able to make his lifelong dream come true. He returns to Oldham and wins the election there as a Conservative candidate. And from there, he's going to embark upon his great and incredibly storied political career. I would also at this time like to end our story here with a few happy notes, so to speak. Starting off, before the war ended, Winston's friends Elmer Haldane and Sergeant Brocky both successfully escaped from the Staats Model and would make their way back into the war effort. Good for them. Further, Winston Churchill would be reunited with his servant soldier Thomas Walden, and they would continue to have many more wonderful years of friendship until Walden would eventually pass away in the 1920s. And finally, for all of those who've been with us since part 1, if you remember that Winston had bought roughly 10,000 pounds worth of supplies for the war, most of it being liquor, don't worry, Winston got all of it back in the end, and more, which really makes for a pleasant ending. I generally don't like to end a documentary such as this with terms such as, "Wow, what a wonderful life." But it's incredible to see what this man accomplished and how fortunate he was in doing what he did. How many amazing people came to his aid. Also, the amounts of free cigars, chicken, and liquor that he got trying to escape is insane. I've never heard of such a luxurious escape in my life. I could take this. I'll take it right now. Let's do it. That's a joke. This man and his impact on history is known the world over, but the story that gets him started here is so incredible. It really is beyond amazing. Really, fiction could do this no justice. Thank God it's all fact. Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed our discussion today, please like and subscribe below. We thank you for being with us for this 3-part series, and we have many more historical videos as well as travel blogs and foreign correspondence coming to you this year and into the next. Thank you so much for your time, and as always, this is the Eager Beaver signing off.